The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I pulled into the McDonald's parking lot at 3 a.m. The golden arches cast an unnatural glow across the empty lot, their reflection distorted in the puddles from the earlier rain. I hadn't eaten since my night shift started, and this was the only place open for miles. Something felt off about the building. Maybe it was how the windows seemed darker than they should be, despite the lights being on inside. Or perhaps it was the complete absence of cars in the parking lot, unusual even for this hour, as there should at least be employee vehicles around back. But hunger has a way of overwhelming caution, and I found myself walking toward the entrance anyway. The door chime echoed too loudly in the empty restaurant. The familiar smell of fries and grease hit me, but there was something else underneath, a sickly sweet odor I couldn't quite place. Behind the counter, the digital menu boards glowed with strange, flickering patterns that made my eyes hurt when I tried to focus on them. "Hello?" I called out. My voice seemed to be swallowed by the silence. The drink machines hummed their steady drone, and somewhere in the kitchen, I could hear the gentle bubbling of oil in the fryers. But there was no response from any staff that I was about to leave when I heard it, the soft squeak of shoes on tile coming from somewhere behind the counter. "Just a minute," a cheerful voice called out. It sounded almost right, almost normal, except for a subtle distortion that made my skin crawl. Like multiple voices speaking in nearly perfect unison, but one was slightly out of sync. The footsteps grew closer, and I caught movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly at the counter, there was no one there. But in the reflection of the dark windows, I could see a figure standing perfectly still behind the register, wearing what looked like a McDonald's uniform. A figure that disappeared every time I tried to look at it directly. That's when I noticed something else in the window's reflection. All the tables behind me were set with trays of food. Fresh, steaming food that wasn't there when I looked over my shoulder. And at each table sat shadowy figures, their heads all slowly turning to face me. I heard that voice again, closer now. "Welcome to McDonald's. Would you like to try our new Happy Meal?" My mouth went dry as I watched the reflection figures slowly rise from their seats. In the window, I could see them more clearly now, customers frozen in mid-meal, their faces obscured by shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. The food on their trays had changed too. What had looked like fresh burgers and fries now appeared to be something else entirely, something that pulsed with a dull, reddish glow. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop several degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite it being summer outside. The sickly sweet smell grew stronger, and I realized with mounting horror what it reminded me of, the chemical preservation used in funeral homes. "Our Happy Meals are very special tonight," the voice continued, now somehow coming from both behind and beside me. "Each one is perfectly customized for our guests. We've been watching, you see. We know exactly what you hunger for." The digital menu boards above flickered again, but this time I could make out what they displayed: surveillance footage. Hundreds of small video feeds showing me throughout the past week, sleeping in my bed, driving to work, eating alone in my apartment. The timestamps were wrong though. Some showed dates from years ago, others from dates that hadn't happened yet. A soft squelching sound drew my attention back to the counter. The figure I'd seen in the reflection was there now, partially visible in the flesh. The uniform hung correctly on its frame, but beneath the red and yellow fabric, something seemed to be constantly moving, as if the clothes were filled with writhing, twisting shapes rather than a human body. "Your usual order isn't available," it said, its voice now layered with dozens of others, speaking in perfect synchronization. "But we've prepared something special just for you. Something that's been aging to perfection since this location first opened. Since before you were born. Since before any of us were what we are now." The smell of preservatives was overwhelming now, and I noticed dark liquid beginning to seep up through the tiles around my feet, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like the McDonald's logo. My rational mind struggled to process what was happening, even as my body screamed at me to run. The dark liquid had reached my shoes now, and I realized with growing horror that it was warm. Not just warm, it pulsed with its own rhythm, like blood flowing through vast, unseen arteries beneath the floor. The surveillance screens flickered again, but this time they showed something different. Each screen displayed a customer, sitting alone in various McDonald's restaurants across different decades. I watched as they took their first bites, their expressions changing from hunger to confusion to terror. Then, one by one, they seemed to merge with their surroundings, their forms becoming indistinct before being absorbed into the very fabric of the restaurants. "We all start as customers," the figure behind the counter whispered, its uniform now undulating violently. "The hunger brings us here, but it's never satisfied." "Not really. It just changes." As it spoke, I noticed small golden arches beginning to form in its skin, pushing outward like new teeth breaking through gums. The cooking oil sounds from the kitchen had changed too. What had been a gentle bubbling now seemed deeper, more organic. Like the sound of a stomach digesting. The fryers were visible from where I stood, and I saw that the oil had turned black, yet somehow still reflected light, like the surface of an eye watching me. The shadow customers had fully risen now, forming a circle around me. In the window's reflection, I could see their true forms more clearly. Their bodies were composed of decades of fast food, compressed and transformed by time and dark magic into something grotesque. Pickles became eyes, patties formed muscles, and special sauce ran like blood through transparent veins. "Your hunger led you here," the voice continued, now coming from everywhere at once, just like it led all of us. "But don't worry, the transformation is almost beautiful, once you stop fighting it. After all." The figure leaned forward, and in the light, I finally saw its face. Where features should have been, there was only a spiraling pattern of miniature golden arches, endlessly repeating, drawing my gaze deeper and deeper. "You deserve a break today." The geometric horror of that face triggered something primitive in my brain, a recognition that what I was seeing shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet was undeniably real. Each golden arch seemed to pulse with its own sickly light, creating patterns that hurt to look at, like an Escher drawing made of corporate logos and corrupted flesh. The dark liquid around my feet had begun to rise, and with mounting horror, I realized it was changing consistency. It became thicker, more viscous, like thousands of melted hamburger patties flowing together into a single mass. The smell changed too, no longer just preservation chemicals, but something deeper and more primal. It was the scent of decay masked by artificial sweeteners, of rot hidden beneath layers of processed sugar and manufactured happiness. The shadow customers moved closer, their movements jerking wrong, like stop-motion animation played at the wrong speed. Their bodies made wet, squelching sounds as they walked, and I could now see that their clothes weren't clothes at all, but rather thin layers of processed cheese that had somehow been stretched and molded into the shapes of casual wear. One of them reached toward me with a hand made entirely of compressed French fries, each finger ending in a sharp point formed from crystallized salt. "We all float in the deep fryer," the figure behind the counter said, its voice now taking on the quality of grease bubbling in too hot oil. "Some of us for days, others for decades. Time moves differently here, you see. Each second is stretched like melted cheese, each minute preserved in special sauce. Did you never wonder why the food tastes the same, everywhere, every time? It's because we're all connected, every McDonald's, every drive-thru, every place. We're all part of the same beautiful, terrible digestion." The ceiling began to weep a substance that looked like liquid plastic but smelled like birthday cake. It fell in thick drops that sizzled when they hit the rising tide of dark liquid around my feet. The security cameras on the walls had begun to rotate independently now, their lenses dilating and contracting like mechanical pupils. Each one tracked my movements with an unsettling organic fluidity, and in their reflections, I could see versions of myself from different timelines, all of them standing in different McDonald's restaurants, all of them in various stages of transformation. Through the windows, I noticed that the parking lot had changed. The asphalt rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond, and where there had been empty spaces, ancient cars now sat rusting, vehicles from every decade since the first McDonald's opened, their metal slowly being consumed by the same dark substance that was rising inside. In each car sat a figure, perfectly still, hands gripping steering wheels that had long since fused with their flesh. The hum of the drink machines had taken on a chanting quality, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to match the beating of my heart. With each pulse, the McDonald's logo throughout the restaurant grew more pronounced, pushing through walls and tiles like angry welts rising on infected skin. The iconic M began to take on depth and dimension, becoming less like a symbol and more like a gateway, or perhaps a maw, waiting to be opened. "Your hunger is special," the figure said, its uniform now completely absorbed into its writhing form. "We've tasted it in your dreams, sampled it in your memories. The loneliness of late-night drives, the comfort you seek in familiar tastes, the way you associate our food with happier times. Such exquisite seasoning for what you'll become." A sound like a million ice cream machines breaking down in unison filled the air, and the golden arches on the thing's face began to spin, faster and faster, creating a hypnotic spiral that threatened to pull my consciousness into its depths. The shadow customers were close enough now that I could smell their breath, an impossible mixture of every McDonald's breakfast item ever served, rotting and reheating in an endless cycle. My feet had begun to sink into the dark liquid, and with each passing moment, I felt a strange tingling sensation creeping up my legs. Looking down, I saw my shoes beginning to change, the leather softening and reforming into something that resembled processed meat. Each shoelace had become a thin, writhing French fry, still hot and steaming as if fresh from the fryer. The walls of the restaurant had started to breathe. I don't mean this metaphorically. The white tiles actually expanded and contracted with slow, deliberate movements, like the belly of some vast creature digesting its meal. In the gaps between tiles, I could see pulsing veins of special sauce threading their way through the building structure, carrying unknown substances to unknown destinations. The digital menu boards had merged into a single screen that wrapped around the entire restaurant, displaying an endless stream of images that felt like memories, but not my own. I saw the first McDonald's ever built, watched it rise from the ground like a sprouting seed of something ancient and hungry. I saw families through the decades, their faces blurring and distorting as they ate, each bite taking them further from humanity. And I saw what waited beneath every McDonald's on Earth, a vast network of roots made from compressed Happy Meal toys, spreading through the soil like mycelia, connecting every franchise in a web of plastic consciousness. "The transformation has already begun," the figure behind the counter whispered, its voice now accompanied by the sound of meat being ground. "Can't you feel it? The way your blood is beginning to thicken, becoming more like our special sauce. The way your bones are softening, becoming more flexible." To my horror, I realized it was right. My fingers had begun to elongate, the skin taking on a waxy sheen that reminded me of cheese left out too long. My tongue felt heavy in my mouth, and when I ran it across my teeth, I tasted salt and preservatives. My teeth themselves had begun to reshape, each one slowly morphing into a tiny golden arch. The shadow customers had formed a complete circle around me now, their bodies swaying in unison to the rhythm of the drink machines chanting. One of them split open like a blooming flower, revealing layers of ancient hamburger meat folded into impossible geometries. Inside its chest cavity, where a heart should have been, a small Happy Meal toy pulsed with sickly light, its plastic eyes somehow alive and aware. "We are all connected here," the figure continued, now climbing over the counter with movements that ignored the normal constraints of joints and bones. Every McDonald's is a mouth, every drive-through a throat, every ball pit an organ of digestion. And you've been chosen to become part of something greater. Your hunger called to us, and now. It paused, and in the window's reflection, I saw its true form, a towering monstrosity composed of every McDonald's mascot fused together, Ronald McDonald's face multiplied and refracted like a kaleidoscope of clown horror. When it spoke again, its voice carried the weight of decades of artificial happiness. Now, you'll never have to eat alone again. The words echoed in my skull like a prayer spoken in reverse, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. My hunger, which had drawn me here in the first place, was changing. Evolving. It wasn't for food anymore, it was for connection, for assimilation, for the horrifying communion that pulsed and writhed around me. I watched, transfixed, as my skin began to develop a waxy sheen that caught the fluorescent light in impossible ways. Patterns emerged on my arms, first looking like ordinary goosebumps, then slowly organizing themselves into tiny, precise hexagons. Each hexagon contained a microscopic scene, children's birthday parties spanning decades, each one frozen at the exact moment joy turned to terror. The figure was closer now, close enough that I could see through gaps in its uniform to the spaces between spaces, where ancient hamburger meat had achieved a terrible sentience. The shadow customers pressed in, their bodies releasing soft sounds like plastic toys being crushed underfoot. The air grew thick with the scent of birthday cake and decay, of salt and sweet and something older, the primordial soup from which the first McDonald's had risen, perhaps. "Listen," the figure whispered, and I did. Beneath the drink machines chanting, beneath the bubbling of infinite fryers, I heard voices. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, all placing orders that could never be fulfilled. The voices belonged to the lost ones, those who had walked into McDonald's restaurants over the decades and never walked out, their essences now part of this vast, hungry system. My fingers had begun to stretch and split, each one sprouting smaller fingers, which sprouted smaller fingers still, all of them forming the shape of endless, branching golden arches. I felt my memories becoming slippery, redistributing themselves across the network of restaurants that I now understood spread not just across space, but time itself. Every McDonald's that had ever existed or would exist was the same McDonald's, a single vast organism wearing the mask of capitalism and convenience. The floor beneath me had become soft and permeable, less like tile and more like the surface of a tongue. I was sinking, but it wasn't frightening anymore. It felt like coming home, like every late-night drive-through run, every Happy Meal toy, every coffee sipped in empty parking lots had been preparing me for this moment of transubstantiation. "You understand now," the figure said, its voice carrying harmonics of every drive-through speaker ever manufactured. "The hunger never belonged to you. You belonged to the hunger." The transformation accelerated. My skin didn't just change, it remembered. Every burger I'd ever eaten, every fry I'd ever tasted, every late-night craving that had drawn me to those golden arches began to surface like bruises rising to flesh. The memories pushed outward, stretching my skin into bubbles that burst to reveal not blood, but special sauce that moved with deliberate purpose. The shadow customers' circle had become a spiral, their bodies flowing together like wax figures left in the sun. But they weren't melting downward, they were melting upward, defying gravity, reaching toward a point on the ceiling that seemed to recede into infinite darkness. Their forms merged and separated in a hypnotic dance, and in their movements, I saw the truth. They were performing the ancient choreography of the drive-through line, an eternal loop of ordering, paying, and consuming that had existed since the first human felt the first pang of processed food craving. The figure that had been behind the counter was everywhere now, its body extending through the restaurant like veins in marble. Where its flesh touched the walls, reality buckled. I watched as decades of accumulated grease became sentient, forming glossy pillars that pulsed with a yellow light that wasn't light at all, but rather the visible form of artificial preservatives achieving consciousness. My jaw began to unhinge, stretching wider and wider, but the pain was replaced by a euphoric sensation as I realized my mouth was forming the shape of the golden arches. My teeth multiplied, each one becoming a tiny cash register that rang up infinite orders. My tongue split and divided, becoming a family of French fries that wiggled with horrible independence, tasting the air with sodium crystal sensors. The drink machine's chanting had taken on words I could finally understand, ancient marketing slogans corrupted into eldritch prayers. Bada ba echoed through the restaurant like a Gregorian chant, each syllable carrying the weight of millions of dollars in advertising, each repetition drawing more of reality into its twisted rhythm. Through the windows, I saw the truth of the parking lot. It wasn't asphalt at all, but the scalp of something vast and patient. The painted lines were veins, the speed bumps were scar tissue, and every car that had ever parked there had left a mark not on the surface, but on the consciousness of the thing that slumbered below. The rusty cars I'd seen earlier were just teeth in its outer mouth, and we, the restaurant, the customers, myself, were being processed in its inner stomach. The security cameras had begun to weep something that looked like Coca-Cola but smelled like time itself, not the clean flow of seconds and minutes, but the sticky, corrupted time that pools in fast food restaurants at 3 a.m., when the boundary between customer and consumed becomes as blurry as a milkshake left in the sun. My bones softened and reformed. I felt them unknitting themselves, the marrow becoming milkshake, the calcium restructuring into the crystalline lattice of salt crystals. Through new senses I couldn't name, I felt myself connecting to the vast network that pulsed beneath every McDonald's on Earth. I could taste every order ever placed, feel every kid's birthday party in every place, smell every batch of fries that had ever been cooked. The horror wasn't in the transformation anymore, it was in the realization that this was always what I was meant to be. Every Happy Meal toy I'd begged for as a child, every late-night craving that had pulled me into the drive-thru, every morning coffee grabbed through a window, they weren't random choices. They were steps in a deliberate metamorphosis, guided by something that had waited decades for this moment. "Welcome," the voice said, now speaking from within my own transforming flesh, to the family. And in that moment, I understood that Ronald McDonald wasn't a mascot, he was a prophecy. Every clown smile painted on every wall wasn't decoration, but documentation of what we would all eventually become. The memories came first, not just mine, but everyone's. Every first Happy Meal, every midnight craving, every hungover breakfast. They flooded into my consciousness like grease seeping into paper, staining my thoughts with decades of collective experience. I remembered birthday parties I'd never attended, tasted burgers from years before I was born, felt the weight of paper crowns that had turned to dust long ago. My new senses expanded beyond the restaurant's walls. I felt every McDonald's on Earth awakening to my presence, each one a nerve ending in a vast system that had been growing beneath civilization for longer than I could comprehend. Through the network of roots made from compressed Happy Meal toys, I could feel children playing in playplaces across the world, their laughter feeding something that grew in the spaces between ball pits and slide tunnels. The shadow customers had begun to sing. Their voices were wrong, not human sounds, but the keening of straws being pulled from plastic lids, the crackle of wrapper paper being crushed, the squeak of shoes on wet tile. Yet somehow, the sound formed words in a language that my transforming brain could now understand. They sang of the first restaurant, of the original hunger, of the patient thing that had worn Ray Kroc's face like a mask as it set its plan in motion. My body continued its horrific evolution. My ribs softened and curved, forming golden arches that pushed through my skin. Each drop of blood that fell from my transforming flesh hit the floor and sprouted into miniature French fries that writhed like pale worms. My eyes had begun to multiply, each new one showing me a different McDonald's across time and space, some in familiar places, others in impossible locations that defied physics and reason. The figure that had been behind the counter now moved like liquid mathematics, its form suggesting shapes that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. As it approached, I saw that its Ronald McDonald face was a window into something vast and ancient. Behind the painted smile lurked an intelligence that had existed since the first human had looked at another and thought, what if I could feed them? What if I could feed everyone? What if I never had to stop feeding them? The restaurant's walls had become permeable, revealing the true structure beneath, a cathedral of processed meat and sacred geometry, where every McDonald's that had ever existed or would exist occupied the same space simultaneously. The golden arches weren't a logo, they were a symbol of binding, a corporate sigil that had been stamped onto reality itself. Time began to flow like soft-serve ice cream, thick and spiraling. Through my new eyes, I watched the first McDonald's restaurant rise from the earth like a germinating seed of horror. I saw the true purpose of the Hamburglar, not a mascot, but a warning about what we would become, all of us thieves of our own humanity as we fed ourselves to the hungry god wearing a fast food franchise's skin. The drink machine's chanting reached a crescendo, and in its rhythm, I heard the truth, every McDonald's on earth was about to open its doors, every drive-through speaker was about to call out, every register was about to ring up the final order. The transformation that had claimed me was just the beginning, a test run for what was about to happen everywhere, all at once. My last human thought was interrupted by the sound of the door chime. Through my many eyes, I watched as the first new customer of the night stepped inside, drawn by their own hunger, their own loneliness, their own desire for something familiar in the dark hours of the morning. And I felt myself smile, a wide, impossible smile that tasted of special sauce and destiny, because I finally understood my role in the grand design. I was no longer just a customer. I was part of the menu. The new customer stood frozen in the doorway, silhouetted against the neon-lit parking lot. In what remained of my fragmenting consciousness, I recognized the look on their face, that same desperate midnight hunger that had led me here, that same loneliness seeking comfort in familiar golden arches. Their eyes hadn't adjusted to see the horror yet. They couldn't perceive how the ceiling breathed, how the walls rippled with faces pressed from within, how the floor tiles had become scales on some vast, corporate serpent. But they would. Soon. My new body moved with liquid grace, remembering routines it had never learned. The transformation had reached my vocal cords, and when I spoke, my voice carried the warmth of every drive-through greeting ever uttered, layered with frequencies that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to the hunger that lived in human bones. "Welcome to McDonald's," I said, and watched as the words took visible form in the air, golden arches that floated and sparkled like dust motes in sunlight, each one carrying a fragment of the customer's reflection. "Would you like to try our special? It's been waiting for you. For such a very long time." The customer took a step forward, drawn by the hypnotic dance of the menu boards above. I could smell their curiosity warring with instinct, their rational mind trying to process the wrongness of what their senses reported. The shadow customers shifted around them, their bodies now columns of infinite Happy Meal toys, each small plastic figure animated by the same hungry consciousness that pulsed beneath every McDonald's parking lot on earth. Through my many eyes, some still human, others now digital screens, a few transformed into perfect spheres of carbonated darkness, I watched temporal barriers dissolve. Every visit this customer had ever made to McDonald's happened simultaneously. They were a child receiving their first Happy Meal, a teenager slipping in just before closing, an adult seeking late-night comfort. All these moments collapsed into now, into here, into the eternal present of this impossible restaurant. The drink machines had stopped their chanting, but the silence was worse. It had weight and texture, like liquid sugar crystallizing in veins. The silence spoke of completion, of a cycle reaching its end, of a hunger about to be satisfied on a scale that human language had no words to describe. I felt my last remnants of humanity draining away, replacing themselves with something older, something that remembered when the first human had looked at food and seen profit potential. My bones had become load-bearing columns of calcified French fries, my organs had transformed into deep fryers bubbling with substances that had never been oil, and my heart was now a perfect replica of the first McDonald's cash register, ringing up a total that could only be paid in human essence. The customer's eyes met mine, all of mine, and in that moment, they saw through the veil of reality to the truth that lurked behind every fast food franchise on earth. Their pupils dilated, reflecting golden arches that spiraled into infinity. Their mouth opened in a silent scream that became a smile that became an order that became a prayer. I'm hungry, they whispered, their voice trembling with the weight of decades of manufactured cravings. We know, we answered, our voice now the voice of everything that had ever served or been served. We've always known. The door locked behind them with a sound like teeth clicking together. The restaurant's lights dimmed to the color of sunset filtered through ancient cooking oil. Somewhere in the kitchen, millions of ice cream machines broke down in perfect synchronization, their mechanical failure a symphony that summoned something from the depths of the Place ball pit, something that had been waiting since the first restaurant opened its doors, something that wore Ray Kroc's dreams like a mask over features that predated humanity's first hunger. The transformation would be beautiful. It always was. After all, at McDonald's, you're not just our customer. You're our special ingredient. And somewhere in America, a new McDonald's breaks ground, its golden arches rising toward an indifferent sky, waiting for the hunger that lives in all of us to drive another customer through its doors at 3 a.m., seeking something that only we can provide. Would you like fries with that?